here. Good morning, everyone. We are Koch Agronomic Services, and so as a company, we focus on nutrient use efficiency. So we make products that help you get more value out of your fertilizer investment. And today, we're here to present the results of a demonstration trial that we did actually on site here earlier this month. And our focus today is on volatilization loss, which is one of the three main loss mechanisms for nitrogen. So which forms of fertilizer nitrogen are most susceptible to volatilization loss? Can anybody tell me? Well, anhydrous can volatilize, but we inject it below the surface, so we have less risk there. It's a different one that I'm looking for.
Urea.
Urea is the biggest risk for volatilization loss. Are there any others? Think about fertilizers that contain urea. UAN, that's right. A lot of people think liquid UAN is not as prone to loss, and it certainly is less susceptible to loss than white urea, but it has a fairly high loss profile as well. So those are the two forms of fertilizer that we're trying to protect, and we actually have focused here today on UAN. So we've got a trial set up that Bryce is going to lead you through, but before we do that, I want to ask you all, what form of nitrogen volatilizes off the soil? What are we losing to the atmosphere in volatilization loss? Ammonia gas, right? And so a lot of people have mistakenly said nitrous oxide. Well, nitrous oxide can be a form of loss from the soil, and it's important to the climate, but it's economically much less important to your farming operation than volatilization loss, because volatilization loss can be very high. It can be as high as 30 to 40% under the wrong conditions. So if you get a bad loss scenario, and you're putting on 100 pounds of N, you could be losing 30 to 40 pounds of nitrogen. That translates through to a lot of yield potential that you're leaving on the table if you don't protect your N. And so this experiment is really designed to measure volatilization losses. And I'm going to ask Bryce here to lead us through what the experiment is and how it kind of works.
All right, so as you can imagine, when you're trying to put some nitrogen down, it's really hard to try to capture that ammonia volatilization. So how do you do that? Does anyone have any idea? How do you check for ammonia in the air? If anyone has chicken barns or anything like that, they might have used something along this line. It's called a dosy tube, and it's these little guys here. They're all taped up on here. So these little tubes, and they will detect how much ammonia is in their presence, and then we can kind of see a number in parts per million on that. But as you can imagine, if you put some nitrogen down, there's a lot of atmosphere down here, right, that ammonia can go to. So what we do is we use a little box like this. You drill the little holes, and you put a little stake right where you put the nitrogen down. You attach the dosy tube there, and then you leave it there for a bit of time, and then you come back and you can keep checking depending on your time frame, on everything that you're looking at, and see how much ammonia volatilization is there. Now, there is a complicated formula. You can try to figure out how many pounds per acre and everything, and it's really just the best guess as the time thing. But what it really works well for is actually doing a comparison. You're looking at an untreated versus a treated system. So in this case, as Tim mentioned, we were looking at UAN. So we had straight UAN go down. Then we had a couple of our products. We have a urease inhibitor called Anvil. So I don't know if any of you use that in your nitrogen, and also a dual inhibitor. As Tim talked a little bit about the urease inhibitor, but also that nitrification inhibitor. A dual inhibitor has both of those, and that's called Tribune, compared to a competitor. Now, we also wanted to look at a few different ways that this was done. So we looked at putting that UA down 3 different ways. So the first way was just a simple broadcast with a flat fan nozzle running through, looking at that nitrogen going down. So it went down at 40 gallons per acre of that UAN, put down with a flat fan. So when that was done, so it was just done on some wet soil, put the stake down, attach the dosy tube. One of these dosy tubes were attached into that stake, and then covered up, and then came back to have a look at it. So one of these situations where you'd expect to see, a fair bit of volatilization that would happen, because you just put, UAN just right on the soil surface, right? It's not incorporated, it's nothing, it's just right on top of the soil, and have a look. So some of the numbers that we have coming out of there, just so you have on this experiment. So this one here, and I don't know if anyone can kind of see, but feel free to come up and have a look after too before you leave. If you kind of want to see how it looks, you can kind of see where these dosy tubes start out as kind of a pinky purple color, and then as they become yellow as they measure the amount of ammonia volatilization that is happening there. So we had 340 parts per million is kind of what the number came out on the Dosey tube. So just to put that in perspective. And then we added Tribune in there. So again, because that broadcast of the flat flan is probably going to happen early in the season, it's going to be a long time before the corn's going to need that nitrogen. We wanted to use a dual inhibitor to make sure we're preventing all forms of losses from occurring there. So we used Tribune, and it came in at 220 parts per million. And then there was a competitor product, another dual inhibitor, that came in at 210. So very close in terms of that, but we're seeing that benefit just from keeping that ammonia from being lost and keeping more of that nitrogen there. So I don't know if anyone have any questions on kind of the broadcast one. Pretty straightforward. How many people are doing that kind of an application, for my own curiosity here? Anyone doing kind of UAN broadcast of the flat fan? Got a few hands going up? Okay. So
is it worse on the wet soil?
It can definitely when you have wet soil, but when it's on the surface, it can really vary just because you just need a little bit of moisture, and we'll be talking after lunch a little bit more on the mechanisms and everything along there, so we'll go a little bit more details, but really all you need is a little bit of moisture to really start that volatilization, but there are a number of factors that can play in increasing the amount, and increasing that soil moisture definitely does have an effect on that as well. So.
One of the common misperceptions about UAN is that because it's a liquid form, there's enough liquid water in UAN to incorporate the urea deep enough that you don't get lost. And that's simply not true. There's just not enough water there. Even if you concentrate it in a band, it's still only a few hundredths of an inch of water per acre, and that's just inadequate water to incorporate the nitrogen and prevent loss. And so that's why you have to really be conscious about protecting UAN, and wet soil definitely is more vulnerable to loss than bone dry soil would be.
So rain does take it in, but
and we'll show a graph on this later this afternoon after lunch, but you need a minimum of half an inch of rain to stop volatilization loss from happening. So you drive that urea nitrogen deep enough in the soil profile that the soil can hold on to the ammonium end. And so if you get less than half an inch of rain, let's say you get a tenth, you're expecting a half inch and you get a tenth, that sets you up for a worst case scenario, because it's just enough water to trigger hydrolysis and breakdown of the urea, but it's not enough to incorporate it, so you maximize loss then. You get really high rates of loss whenever you get low amounts of rainfall.
Okay. All right, we'll jump to the next slide. So this, I don't know, this might be a more common. We'll ask the question. So this is knifed in side dress is the next one. How many people are doing a knifed in side dress of UAN? Got a few more looking at it. So again, this is going to be one of these ones where you're thinking you're kind of putting it in the soil, and hopefully it's protected, but one of the things we'll show later is how you need to put it really in deep to really make sure it's protected, and you need to get good row closure. In this case, we looked at a situation where we didn't get quite as good a row closure on that knifed in as maybe you'd like to see, so there's a few cracks and stuff there to really kind of simulate having some of those issues where you're not getting that good closure and seeing what kind of losses we'll see. So same setup, 40 gallons per acre of UAN knifed in, so untreated, 460 parts per million. So it's actually even worse than the broadcast, because you're going in, you're not going in deep enough, you're not getting that row closure, so you're getting maybe a little bit more of that soil moisture, a little bit more interaction with some of those enzymes, and that's causing even more volatilization losses that are happening there. So we want to look at two different ways of helping to protect that nitrogen. So we have the straight urease inhibitor with Anvil. So that's going to protect only against that volatilization losses. And we dropped that loss to 125 parts per million. So pretty significant there. So even with that injected, using enhanced efficiency fertilizer to protect against volatilization, we're seeing substantial benefits on keeping that nitrogen there, and it's going to be more available for the corn later on. We also wanted to look at Tribune, so again, that dual inhibitor that protects from that volatilization losses, but also denitrification, so the nitrous oxide losses and leaching losses potential. And we dropped that even down further to 100 parts per million. So a really good demonstration there, and showing how even having those products there. Again, these are going to be slightly, you're not going to be able to really do a good stats on them or anything like that, but it's kind of showing you that both kinds of forms of protection are really going to help you out on there as well. And then the competitor coming right in there at 160 parts per million. So again, another dual inhibitor, their competitor, and kind of looking at that. And so you're kind of seeing that benefit versus the untreated. So definitely, if you're going out and you're doing that knifed in application on a side dress, make, having a protection there is really going to help in case you're not getting that row closure, you're not getting quite deep enough, all those different things that happen. We know there's variability on your farms, right? So some fields you're just not going to be able to hit what you're trying to do. So by adding that in is really going to help in a long
How
run.
deep do you need to go to get really low?
You need to go really low, yeah. If you can get down 3 inches, that's going to be kind of your best case scenario to be really protected from that standpoint, which is tough to do, especially I think you're churning soil and everything else. So to keep things down at 3 inches, plus you get some wear on your openers and everything else. You get slightly, bends and stuff on where your stream's coming out. You can have some issues even keeping it down there, and you can start to get some of that worked into the soil and be a little narrow, and that's where it's going to be really prone for loss too. So
Yeah, when you get into no-till systems, we're seeing the emergence of what we call like slice and squirt injection, where you just have a disc opener and you're just squirting UAN into the crack, and you don't really have a closure system. You don't have a knife knifing it in. Those are really prone. I probably didn't do a proper introduction earlier. I'm Tim Lotch, Director of Agronomy for North America for Koch, but I farm, my accent gave me away to somebody here earlier, I farm in Illinois. And so I do a lot of sidedress UAN application with an injection system, but on no-till, a lot of times the injection slot stays open. And so I tend to run Anvil when I do sidedress injection on all of my no-till acres. Now on conventional till acres where you're maybe a little bit more likely to get slot closure, then I'm more worried about below ground losses, not the volatilization so much, and then I will use the nitrification inhibitor. So one of the things you'll hear from us later this afternoon is there are good tools to protect against loss, but you've got to pick the right tool out of the box to manage the risk that you have in the environment you're working in and with the method that you're using.
any other questions on the knifed in demonstration? I could have timed that better. I appreciate that. I'll pay you your $20 later.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
That is the next demonstration, is a Y drop on a later application. So I appreciate that question. Thank you so much. I'm going to get you to stick around for the other tours to come through as well. But yeah. So no, for sure. So yeah, absolutely. When you go with the Y drop, it's definitely a big concern with it, especially with the Y drop, because now you're starting to, those bands are really, you're starting to concentrate those bands as well, and you're putting it right at the surface. It's going to be a little bit bigger, right? So you're going to have a little more canopy, all that humidity. You can definitely see some big losses that happen with a Y drop application. So in this case, we did untreated. We maxed her out. We filled this whole dosy tube. So right now we have greater than 750 parts per million. We don't know how much we lost because we maxed out the whole dosy tube. So the whole thing plus. So significant loss is what we saw with that Y drop. Pretty substantial with it. So with that, and then when we go with the Y drop, and the other thing to think with the Y drop, because it is happening later, we're probably less likely to want to use a dual inhibitor because we don't really need to protect from those that nitrification losses, the leaching or denitrification, because that corn crop's going to be using it a lot faster and everything else. So just protecting with a straight urease inhibitor is kind of probably where we need to be with that. So that's really going to be one. So we just looked at Anvil here, so that straight urease inhibitor. So that one came in 150 parts per million. So pretty substantial protection there with it. And again, that's just making sure that you're using, a good product, because you, as you said, you are putting in probably some of the worst conditions you can do for some volatilization losses on the top there. Then we had a competitor. This one came in at 510 parts per million, so definitely higher. And that's probably one thing to think about, is just making sure that you're using the right rate of product. It is a bit of buyer beware in terms of enhanced efficiency fertilizers. You do have to be careful. A lot of the products out there, they'll have different amounts of active ingredients in it. Different active ingredients, like Anvil contains a combination of NBPT, which is a very common one, but also a proprietary one to Koch. It's called Duramide. And so you're really kind of getting two actives in there, though they're both urease inhibitors, so they're doing the same thing, but that's really kind of giving you kind of a really good, robust protection with it. Sometimes if you go with some of the other products out there, you start looking, you dive into the numbers, you'll see their numbers are pretty low. And it's going to be depending on conditions. Sometimes you don't need quite as much protection, other times you'll need a lot. So something like in this situation where this was done here just in August, On crops that are bigger, you know, there's probably been a bit more moisture, some heat and everything else. That's really going to drive volatilization, and I think that's why you're really seeing some of that separation between products that have a lower rate in it versus a product, you know, that's going to have probably the most protection out there. So
Yeah, right. I mean, that's an excellent point. I think it bears repeating because, you know, what we see with our products, and you know, this was probably the main reason I came to Koch and I work for Koch, is that our products are loaded with enough active ingredient to really protect you when the sledding gets rough. And under those high loss scenarios, you see the difference. That's when the difference really starts standing out. Is our products separate from the crowd when the going gets tough, and that's really when you need the most protection. That's your worst case loss scenario, is where you give up enough yield potential and enough revenue that you could have paid for protection on your nitrogen for several seasons. That catastrophic loss scenario is the one that you're really trying to guard against.
yeah. So anyone have any questions on that? Like, did that kind of help answer with the wide drop there?
The implication has been that that's the best way to go. If you aren't using the inhibitor, am I going to have better or less loss with urea in some fair proportion of the ESN, you know, the state level incorporated? Am I actually going to lose less in into the air than the person using the wide drop?
It's really going to depend on the conditions you get going through the growing season, right? You know, even with the urea, same thing. You need to get it down in there. So if you're going with a bare urea and you're not getting it down, you still can have that volatilization losses that happen. You could, and those conversions are going to start to happen too. So maybe if you get some big rainfalls before, you know, the corn's really starting to suck that nitrogen out of the soil, you can start to see some losses from that standpoint with just even going with a straight urea earlier versus, you know, coming in, you know, the nice thing that wide drop closer to when it needs it, right? That's kind of the target of it. But then it's protected, so you're going to kind of really help the corn make the most of it. If you go to something like a polymer coated product, they are an EF, but they kind of work differently, right? Because they're covered with a plastic, and then as the moisture goes in, that breaks apart and starts to leak out. And again, that's also going to be indicative of what kind of rainfall you get. If it's a long time, then yeah, you can see some protection. But if you get some, you know, wet soils shortly after application, you can see those polymer coats break down pretty quick as well. So it's one of these things. I probably didn't do a good introduction either, Bryce. Guys, I'm the senior agronomist for KS here in Canada, and I'm going to give you that agronomist answer. Is it depends on what happens with your application, your equipment, the weather you're going to have, and no 2 years are the same. So it is really trying to do the best you can. Is really kind of picking the nitrogen applications that work with your equipment on your farm, and then which products you can use to best protect it to kind of manage it. So it's kind of without knowing all the details, it's always hard to kind of go into some of those specifics. So
you're showing these numbers, like what we talk, like 50% loss, 20% loss, 25.
You know, I didn't do the complex calculations to go through with it, but it really is going to depend. So something like this, where you're seeing that greater than 750, and that's going to be getting into that worst case scenario that Tim was talking about. So that could be, you know, 30, 40% is probably kind of a good rough number in terms of it, and then you can kind of base on that. So number, you know, if you're getting down, you know, with these protected ones, 150, 100 parts per million, that's going to be a lot less, right? You're still getting some losses, but maybe that falls into, you know, 5% type idea. You know, it's kind of rough,
Yeah.
thumb in the wind kind of thing. So.